Welcome to Duncan Thorin Shields YouTube channel. I managed to con Duncan into convincing his friend to pay me thousands and thousands of dollars as a professional Counter-Strike player, so maybe he can convince you that some of his analysis is correct.
To the surprise of pretty much nobody, felps is the 5th player for the new MiBR lineup, completing the 5 players they need. They obviously got Zeus back as a coach as well, along with Taco, and therefore they've replaced the 2 North American players. Stewie went in exchange for Taco and Zeus. Tarek is in theory benched, but looks as though he's going to wait and take a different offer elsewhere, being as there's now a Brazilian lineup in MiBR, and they're not going to be using players who can't speak Portuguese. So even though it was widely reported that indeed felps would be the player, there was no denials of that. There was some silly attempts at jokes that didn't really land. They just weren't that funny, but whatever. We all know it was the case, but now we can officially talk about it. So now that the lineup is set, obviously it's the same lineup that played back in 2017. They won 5 out of 6 titles over the summer. If everyone remembers, this was the basic story of the team. They got in felps and they immediately went to DreamHack Masters Malmo. It was the 2nd event of the year after the major, because obviously for the major they'd had Fox as a stand-in. They, despite the fact that they hadn't practiced much, they made 2nd place, but admittedly they had the easier side of the bracket. Then they went to Katowice and Star Series, and they bombed out in the groups there, both tournaments, but actually had very strong performance from the likes of Fur, felps. These players were really going off at these tournaments, but somehow they weren't doing well as a team, admittedly some close losses. Then they began this run where they won 5 out of 6 titles. I've explained how those aren't 6 big titles. In fact, most of them weren't big titles, so they weren't quite as dominant as it seemed. But you know what? They were the #1 team in the world, and this was a nice little run to show that they could be champions, as I indeed had said they could be. Then they went into the major as the favourites. Now, while the 2 big favourites for the major were obviously SK Gaming and FaZe Clan, because they'd won the recent tournaments, FaZe Clan went 0-3 and bombed the tournament, and actually SK Gaming, quite frankly, was doing pretty well. They did really well in the Swiss system. They got out. Unfortunately, they got drawn in that 2-3-1-1 round, so they had to play Astralis with the same ones them. Astralis famously beat them with Device going crazy, and they went out top 8. Now, already they were disappointed in that. They felt like that was a chance to win a major, so scrutiny was on them. After the player break, they did the Mykonos event, they did New York. Both events, they made the semi-finals. Both events, they lost to Team Liquid. So the Mykonos event, they were hands down the best team there. They should have won it, but they didn't. Lost to Team Liquid. Losing to Team Liquid in New York wasn't the end of the world. They still overall played an okay series. Cold Zero played amazingly. You just had a great performance from Liquid. Still made top 4, still very reliable. And at the time, obviously the team that dominated that tournament was FaZe Clan. They looked unstoppable. And people said, who are the teams who could beat FaZe Clan? I made videos on the topic. Obviously, to me, SK were the first name out the box because they're great under pressure. They've got a lot of skill themselves. They're good at comebacks. They don't give up in games. They can play the maps that FaZe Clan plays. And indeed, they ended up being, after a couple of bad tournaments, most notably E-League Premier, and then I think they had another one that wasn't that great, they decided to make a kick. And what they did was, they kicked out felps, they brought in bolts, and they won 3 of the next 4 tournaments. They were the #1 team. They were beating FaZe Clan. It all worked out. The problem is they couldn't use bolts for the major, so they brought felps back for the major. And you know what? They had a great run. They made it all the way to the semi-finals. Like, sure, they could have lost the series to Fnatic. That was very close to the quarterfinals. But they also absolutely could have beaten Cloud9 in that series. Go watch the series. Go watch the 3rd map. It was right there at one point in time. Cloud9 did a really nice performance on that deciding map. So they actually could have been in the final of that major. If they'd been in the final, they would have been playing FaZe Clan. I think actually they had a shot at winning that major, despite the fact they were a bit petulant and talked about how the major doesn't mean anything and how they weren't going to practice with the proper lineup. They were going to practice with the bolts lineup to win WESG for more money. Now, obviously, the bolts lineup completely shit the bed from there on out. Generally didn't have many top placings. Went to shit. They kicked Taco. Then they got in Stewie 2K. They kicked bolts. Then they got in Tarek. So everyone knows the downhill story in 2018, like how it didn't work out and they just weren't a very successful team after that major that they played at the standing. But the point is, they have this history with felps before. So in terms of MiBR, yes, it was the right move to remove Tarek. He never worked with the team, wasn't even close to working, quite frankly. Yes, as a team, they were good, and they were one of the better teams. They were top 5, top 6 team in the world, but they were never close to actually being like, aside from a one-off win that could have happened, which didn't, They were never going to win the big international tournaments. It just wasn't reliable, and they weren't going to knock Astralis off the top. In fact, they weren't even going to be as good for my money as Na'Vi or FaZe Clan overall. Like, those teams were just better. Team Liquid obviously much better, including with Taco and Zeus, former teammates. So I thought it was a waste of Tarek's talent, and it was a waste of their own talents. They had such good pieces, they clearly needed a different piece to bring out the best in them. So removing Tarek, first of all, allows you to swap back to Portuguese. They also had a coach who speaks it, and Zeus. Totally logical move. The person they brought in is, I think, a better player than Tarek, is the right player to bring in. It's felps. It's the right move to do. I know the KNG gamble might have been interesting, but he has his own reasons as to why that would be a downside. I actually think that this is the best player you can recruit at this point in time. This is a guy where I don't think they made full use of last time. I think he has a lot more potential than he showed, but he was also a very good player early on in that lineup, and at least a very competent player for most periods of time. Very good fragging numbers for someone who wasn't always doing the role he wanted to do and was scapegoated. But the key thing for me is them letting go of him wasn't necessarily the wrong move overall. Like, I do think that he needed to go elsewhere, see what his options were, see how they fell apart, see how he could play well and still be nowhere, to humble him a little bit so he's a bit more open to working on the game. Might be a little detail about that in the second part of my Fallen's reflections when it comes out. I think that'll end up being good for them, but I also think it's good for MiBR and felps, because I think that actually for felps, now MiBR sees your potential and sees that they need a player like you. Before, they just took you in because you were the most obvious pickup. Now they know they need you, just as they know they need Zeus because he's beaten them so many times. I think now there will be a lot more understanding, and they will work towards finding a solution to that. Because for me, using felps in a little bit of a different way than they used him last year is the way. I think because of Fur's injury and the fact that he's already had a drop-off in form at the end of the year, they should actually give felps more priority, more emphasis, make him more, give him more resources in the game, and make Fur take a bit of a backseat, at least initially, and see how it goes. Because felps has the talent level where he could make that a very good move. He could make it so you could be winning championships again. If coldzera and felps are your best players, and Fur's your third or fourth best, now you're talking about a very strong lineup. And Fur's clearly a guy who's done that in the past. 2016, he was someone who was willing to make a bit more space, seemingly sacrificed formerly being the star player, to give it up to coldzera. So I think the players are there, the time's right for it. I'm sure some of these players consider retirement or maybe just making this their last couple of years. So let's win on the way out. Let's try and win majors. Let's fuck all the politics and all the personal differences or stylistic differences. Let's just get a team that works out of this lineup and go and try and win the major, go and try and win big tournaments. And hopefully along the way, now you've got an all-Brazilian lineup again, now you've got these players, try and regain some of that identity that made you so legendary. Being clutch, always being able to come back in a game, being able to win the close matches, the really high pressure matches. There's not a lot of teams in Counter-Strike at the moment can do that reliably. Like, Astralis is basically it. So I would say, and Team Liquid versus people not called Astralis, so, or in finals. So I think if they can do that, that will automatically make them a counter to some of these other teams in the scene, the Na'Vis, the FaZe Clans, the Mouse Sports of the world, and they will immediately be able to potentially leapfrog or get to the same level as these teams and challenge for big titles. I think felps is a very skilled player. I think he's a very skilled rifler. It's just in the past, because he hadn't had proper coaching, because he hadn't played with a lot of good players, he only had this one shot at a really top team. I think he was ruined by praise, by being told you're the best player in Immortals, you can do what you want, you know what you're doing here, you're the best, play the way you want to play. And he never developed his game or developed it to the extent that he could demand resources and a certain style of play, which I think he now logically can do with this set of circumstances. Another key aspect that people will not think about is now you have Zeus in the lineup. They didn't have Zeus in 2017. He'd already gone after they won their second major, ESL 1 Cologne. He was off playing Immortals, and then obviously he became the coach of Team Liquid. Now, first of all, he has played with felps, should have a sense for how felps is as a person, as a player. Also, he's been watching the SK team when he wasn't in the team, and he's beaten the felps lineup of SK, and he's seen SK without felps. I think this is a guy who should be able to give you some fresh perspective, should have an idea of how felps should have been used, what you could exploit when felps was in the lineup. I think he's someone, crucially, who can play a bigger brother role in the team, and he can keep the egos in check. And if there are problems with felps, doing something or improving something or adjusting in some way, you can have Zeus go to him and say that. It doesn't have to be Fallen do it and then for you have conflicts in the game. It doesn't have to be one of the star players who says, let's kick this guy out if he's not doing things. You can bring these things to Zeus and he can deal with them tactfully and he can build up a personal relationship with these people. Dead and Yanko couldn't do that. Dead's the manager. Yeah, he's friends with them, sure. He can't be the guy who goes and tells you that. Yanko doesn't speak Portuguese. He can't get on that closer personal basis with you, and you don't have the history with him. Fallen can't do that because he has to play in the game and be the in-game leader as well. It's going to be hard for him to criticise you unduly and then also punish you, but then also want you to do what he says in the game. So Zeus is the ideal person to take that up. I think felps is the best person to pick at this point in time, and I'm very excited for this lineup, I have to say. I'm not one of these people who's down on it and thinks, oh, why make that team again? It's not quite that team. You didn't have Zeus, and I think people have changed in the meantime. Now, sure, some of them might not be as good, but I think that can be overcome in due time. So for me, I genuinely think this team has the potential to be a challenger for Astralis. They can be a team who could potentially win a major, can win big international tournaments. They can be a team who's gunning for that #1 spot. I would hope at very worst they end up being a top 4, top 3 ranked team in the world and they win a couple of titles. I think the potential is there to recreate that identity. I think they took some of it for granted and thought it was just in their DNA. I think people like Fallen, Fur and Cold Zero just thought they were the clutch ones. They were the ones who were winners. They forgot that period before they had Taco on FNX where they weren't winning dick. So I actually think that, yeah, this is a great move. I think there's a lot of potential. Sure, you're starting out in a place where there's a lot to fix. There's a lot to figure out about how you're going to use people. You've got to get certain people back in form. You've got to adjust again to going back to Portuguese, to being a team that's going to play a different style from what you've just been learning under Yancourt and playing with there. You're going to have to reformulate. You're going to have to make a new blueprint. But that is what this team has proven successful at in the past. I have a lot of respect for the fact that Fallen's been willing to do the tough cuts. That he's been willing to say to these guys, right, this guy is not going to make it, so let's cut him now before it gets worse. I will say, though, this is an issue I have. Even though it's hard to see how this move fails, part of why I think the lineup failed at the end so hard with felps and with Taco and with Waltz later is because they did scapegoat these guys. Like, it's not like they just cut them. They kind of allowed the community to just go in on them. They also implied as much in interviews that they saw there were problems with some of their players and that they had to step it up. Now, they might say, we were doing that actually to give the guy motivation boots, like Zipnik's when he's in TSM and he knew he was going to get cut from rumours. Therefore, he put his arse in gear and he became an amazing player and never again did think about cutting him. You could argue that. Maybe it's a Brazilian thing. I don't know what their culture's like in that sense, if they're very harsh or very open and that kind of thing. But I think those players, yes, were going to shit, and I think they might have eventually needed to be cut. I don't blame them for any of the cuts. I think they're all justified in their own way. Taco, felps, Bolt, FNX. It's just the way that they did it. I'm not quite a fan of that because I think it exacerbated it, and you could have done it a little bit differently. But whatever, it's done now. Now felps is back. Interestingly enough, as I said, I respect the harsh cuts. This is something I talked about with Fallen in part 1 of my reflections with him. Part 2 will be coming out in a few days, probably. So I think this is actually a real good reason to be excited for 2019. If you're one of those people who thought at the end of the year, no one can really challenge Astralis, this team potentially can. Now, FaZe Clan maybe can with a Dren. Who knows if Navi's ever going to change players. But we've got some teams out there that there's real promise, there's real potential. And I don't see why the talent base in this team can't make it. I understood now why the MiBR one can't. I think they lost their identity. I think they were a team that just, the comms weren't there. They lost all of their advantages mainly. Didn't even have the best player in the world. This team, I think, has a real shot at it. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Gardner Wilson, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, NateDOhDoubleG, James Harding, Kyla Harris, Travis Greb, Daniel Yordanov, Tristan Jones, and a special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for upcoming content of mine? Perhaps you'd like to ask me a question for my monthly video AMA. Do you want some teasers to see who the next guests are for my talk shows, for my interviews? Maybe you'd like to take part in a monthly esports discussion with yours truly. Well, put your money where your mouth is at the Patreon link in the description box below and join the Scrilluminati today.